Hello and welcome back to Redirecting. Well, I'm going to be bringing an update to a story that I shared with you earlier. It was actually a story about a woman who had to forfeit a $4 million property to one of her white tenants. Now we're talking about a black woman here, and apparently she had to forfeit her property. And so some more details have come forward on exactly what is happening here. Now, again, for me, it's not completely ironed out as of yet. What I want to do is I want to share another article with you that's a little bit older that talks about some things that she was involved in. And I want you to share your opinion because, again, the initial article that was shared with me, I had a viewer share this with me, and it was basically about her losing the property and it being forfeited to a white tenant. Now, when you look at those circumstances, I can look at that situation and say that what they did is not fair. I've never seen this done before, where they would take a whole property, a 5-unit, where the tenant was only occupying one. Okay. When you separate this situation, it's still not fair, okay? Even with their own laws saying that you can evict a tenant and have a relative go into that property, or you yourself can move in. Okay, that being said, we're going to set this particular situation aside, and I'm going to read some more backstory on her legal troubles as a landlord. Okay, in San Francisco, they are calling her the cruelest landlord. And it says that she's losing buildings. And they're adding $7 million in fines. Okay, so that's just the title alone. Now, this is the article that I'm reading from, right? It said defendants appear to view the relatively minor fees they have incurred as an acceptable cost of doing their business illegally. $7 million in fines. Now, the tenants are okay with this. Now, it doesn't sound like, to me, I'm going to get into the article, it doesn't sound like she has cheap properties either. It sounds like she has buildings that are very costly, okay? Very costly, because we're talking about some large numbers here. For her to have $7 million in fees, I want you all to think about and analyze the whole thing here. Okay, I'm going to try to stay as neutral as possible, even though with that first story, it's very clear to see that in that case that it wasn't fair what happened. It was not fair to take a whole property from someone and give it to a tenant. I've never seen that done. I've never heard of that being done. So let me get into this. It says it's another bad week for Ann Kahaji, the San Francisco property owner whose years of scandal, legal troubles, and convictions for abusing her tenants earned her the reputation as the city's cruelest landlord. Okay, I'm going to stop right there real quick, too. I think it's amazing how I think she's not an American black woman, not that that matters, okay? I think she's from another country, but anyway, I'm still trying to figure out how she earned the reputation of as the cruelest landlord, because before she even set foot on the soil, we've heard all the horror stories that a lot of people have had to endure dealing with landlords, right? So it's going to be interesting to find out why she was being called the cruelest landlord. Okay, it says, now the landlord has earned yet another round of court-ordered penalties as the city yanked Kahaji's buildings out of her hands this week. While she still owns the 8 properties in the neighborhood, like the Mission and Dolores Heights, she is no longer allowed to manage them. Okay, so let's get some more into this and find out why all of this is taking place. And I definitely want your opinions, okay? Because, and I'm going to say this up front, I'm going to try my best to remain as neutral as possible in this, but I am going to inject the fact that laws are not applied equally when you're talking about melanated people and non-melanated people. So far, I haven't seen the smoking gun yet as to why they did this to her. I'm not saying that is not going to happen, right? I'm reading this article with you for the first time. Someone shared other details with me, but they're saying that she's abusive to her tenants. So I want to know, what did she do that's considered abusive to her tenants to the point where they would take her properties from her, and that she has more than $7 million in fines? I want to know what that is. Okay. It says a court order issued this week enjoins the defendant from having any management role at any of the properties for a full 60 months, instead placing a court order receiver in charge. Judge Charles F. Haynes ruled Monday that Kahaji has repeatedly violated previous court orders and injunctions over the past 2 years. The judge called in a receiver because, in short, nothing else seems to have worked. The ruling cites a persistent pattern of bad faith harassment. Okay, that's one thing they're saying. Retaliation and fraud against multiple tenants. Repeated failure to comply with notices of violations. Stop work orders and abatement orders. Repeat efforts to deny plaintiff city the right to inspect the properties. Repeated covering up work done without the required permit or exceeding the scope. Constantly entering tenants' units with unreasonable notices or no notice at all. History of flagrantly violating court orders and complete lack of understanding of unlawfulness of their conduct. Okay, now it says Haynes also added another $470,000 in penalties to the running tab of what Kahaji owes, which, according to Mission Local, now sits somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 million. Now I want to back up a little bit to some of the violations that they are citing her for. Okay, they said a persistent pattern of bad faith harassment. I hope that the article is going to get into more details of what that harassment is. Okay, then it says retaliation or fraud against multiple tenants. I want to know more details about that. I think some were saying that she was evicting tenants without good cause, but maybe the article will expound more on that, because this doesn't really give too many details. And then it says repeated failure to comply with the notices of violations. So I'm also curious to know what the violations are. And then it said stop work orders and abatement orders, and not allowing bailiffs or plaintiffs, inspectors to enter into the property. So again, I would like more details on that to see exactly what they are talking about here, because harassment, retaliation, all of these different things doesn't really give any details other than the legal terminology for it all. Okay, so here we go. It says the judge noted that since May of 2017, Kahaji has been dinged for over 40 violations of court injunctions, continuing harassing tactics like stationing video cameras at tenants' doors 24 hours a day, which she was ordered to stop. Okay, so that one gave some more details. Placing video cameras. Okay. The city's attorney's office, which has jousted with Kahaji for years over the violations, says that despite having record-breaking penalties leveled at her, Kahaji has actually paid relatively little. Defendants appear to view the relatively minor fees they have incurred as an acceptable cost of doing their business illegally, the city attorney's office said in their filings, requesting that the receiver take over. It's been a rough couple of years for Kahaji. Kahaji. I apologize for mispronouncing the name. But in March, the California Supreme Court rejected her appeal of the 2017 ruling that leveled a record-breaking $2.4 million in penalties against her, a number that has since swelled. Okay, see, now this is where I'm having an issue, okay? They said that the $2.4 million in penalties was record-breaking, but now it has swelled to $7 million. So even though she might be guilty of some things, y'all, this is where I'm going to kind of inject my opinion. Even though she might be guilty of some things, $2.4 million is a record-breaking penalty, but that has since swelled to $7 million. So there does seem like that there is some bias going on here yet and still. Because again, under the original video and other posts as well, I have seen where black tenants have been treated horribly by white landlords. And I don't see these type of penalties going on. In Detroit, a lot of property is owned by white landlords, and they do very little to take care of the properties. Okay? I don't see the same type of rulings going on. Now, I know Detroit has its own set of problems, okay? Detroit having people who don't take care of properties as well, not just talking about the owners, but even renters. We've had renters trash properties that we used to own. So I do know that it goes both ways. That you can have landlords who are just horrible landlords, and you can have tenants that are just horrible tenants. It goes both ways. I like to try to be fair and balanced when I talk about these things, but even the article stating that this is a record-breaking penalty, that means if it's record-breaking and it's even swelled to $7 million, that they are not finding other people in the same way. Didn't number 45 have policies against black people and where he wouldn't even rent to them? So anyway, let me keep to the story here before I go off into left field somewhere. It says, in 2018, the city auctioned off several of her buildings in an attempt to recoup some of what she owes. Okay, now, some of what she owes is what? Those record-breaking penalties. So, she owes the city penalties for what? Record-breaking penalties, which gave them a reason and an excuse to auction off some of her properties so that they can recoup some of what she owes them in penalties. So let me keep it moving. I hope that you all can be fair in analyzing this, because we don't see this happening to other landlords. Again, I'm not saying that she didn't have some violations, but I believe, in my opinion, in which I'm entitled to that they are reaching really deep into her pockets unfairly. That's what I'm seeing so far. Let me continue on and see if I can see anything that justifies this woman owing them $7 million in penalties. Okay, again, it says, in 2018, the city auctioned off several of her buildings in an attempt to recoup some of what she owes. This was shortly before the city told her tenants to start paying rent to City Hall instead of her, Kahaji. Kahaji has denied the charge that she's an abusive landlord, instead arguing that her legal troubles stem from grudges on the part of her tenants. Nevertheless, the courts have consistently sided with the tenants and city, convicting Kahaji in 2017 of harassment and fraud. Okay, so by harassment, I guess they're talking about the placement of cameras. Okay, I'm kind of curious about the cameras too, because a lot of public housing has cameras as well that monitors the hallways, including the doors of tenants. When you aim it a certain way, it's getting all of their doors. So I'm trying to figure out why public housing can have cameras in the hallways and on the premises, but this woman can't. I wish I knew more details as to what they are talking about with her cameras, because that seems to be one of the violations that they are talking about here. Okay. All right, so let me get some more into this, and that seems to be the harassment they're referring to, one of the issues of harassment. It said at one point Kahaji owned more than 50 rent-controlled units in the city, a portfolio worth roughly $24 million. Wow. This woman had some money. This woman had some money. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break away from this story for a minute, and I'm going to make a comparison here and see what you all think about this. Again, I'm not saying that she's not guilty of anything, but it seems like they are far-reaching on this. Some of you may remember a story that happened in Missouri. This was a very well-to-do black guy who owned a construction company. And he had land in which he parked many of his construction vehicles on his property. He was doing quite well. He lived in a white community, owning a decent amount of equipment, land, a beautiful home, all of this. If I remember correctly, he was in his 50s, so he was a successful black businessman. Now, I'm going to just get through the story as quickly as I can. But what ended up happening is they started fining him. They came up with reasons to fine him, saying that he wasn't allowed to park his construction vehicles on his property. Okay? And he was like, there is nothing that says I can't park my construction vehicles on the property. And what they started doing was fining him huge sums. I believe it had gotten up to like 100,000, 200,000, 300,000. Eventually, it got up to $500,000 in fines, right? He kept going to city council meetings, the public meetings that they allow people to come in and speak and say things that are on their mind. So he kept going to these meetings, and he was bringing up how they were being unfair in their treatment towards him, and how they're just fining him and doing all of these things to him. And he said, why are you all doing this to me? What they eventually did, and he said, and the story went on to say how they would laugh at him in the meetings. And what ended up happening was the fines that they had levied against him, they attached it to his property. So once they attach it to your property, they then have a right to foreclose and take ownership of your property. Now, we know that this country has a history of doing things to black people, right? What ended up happening in this case, he went to one final meeting. If I can find the story, I would like to link it in the description area, because this was definitely more than 10 years ago or more. But I remember the story being so incredibly sad to me, because the man snapped. With all those fines levied against him and his business and his home, he snapped. When he went into that one meeting, he opened fire, and a good 5 to 6 people, he took their lives, and then his life was taken afterward. And when his brother was interviewed, his brother shared a lot of the details that the news wasn't sharing. And you could tell that he himself, the brother, was a very intelligent, older black man as well. And he said that his brother couldn't take it anymore. He went to war, is what the man said, because of the discrimination that was happening towards him. Now, I'm not trying to say that that's what's happening in this story completely, but I will say that putting those kind of fines on a person's life, on a person's property, and for them to even say that this was a record-breaking fine, it shows that the fines that are levied against so-called black people in this country are far greater than what they do to other people. When I look at certain scandals that have happened throughout history, I forget the one guy's name, but he pulled some type of scam. He was a white guy, and they put him in jail for 2 years. But they did not make him return the millions of dollars that he had stolen. And so that's why this story kind of got to me a little bit. Okay, when they say that she had cameras pointed at their doors, are they saying because these seem like multiple units where she had apartment buildings? Now, from what I've understood, there are people who have cameras in their apartment buildings. Not inside of the tenants' units, but in the hallways. We have seen that. So, again, I'm not sure what's going on here. I wish there were more details, but based on what I've seen so far, I still don't see anything that justifies this woman having to give a building to a single tenant, a whole building, not just that unit back. They didn't say, oh, you have to give her the unit back. They said you have to give her the whole thing. Someone still needs to make that make sense to me. And also, with these other properties and these fines, I need to understand. See, many times, a lot of people just accept something because the city says it. She's did this and she's did that. And they don't even care what the details are. And they go along with what's been said to them without even understanding why does this woman owe $7 million in penalties. If the $2.4 million was unprecedented and unheard of, we know the $7 million is. Why are they fining this woman this much money? How can you calculate fines that high for the stuff that we are seeing in this article? The same with the guy in Missouri. How can you fine someone $500,000, $500,000 for the things that were discussed, and then laugh at him when he comes to appeal the decision? Someone needs to make this make sense. I appreciate those of you who shared with me that there was more to this story. But now that I've read about the more to the story, I'm still having a hard time understanding what warranted these huge fees against this woman and them giving someone, one of her tenants, a whole building. Someone make it make sense for me. Those of you who agree with this ruling, please make it make sense to me. With that, I am out. Be sure to ring the bell to be notified of new uploads on this channel, and also comment, share, like, and subscribe.